And welcome to the One Lung Lounge. My name is Ashley, and today I get the opportunity to talk with Dr. Matt Rice from the GO2 for Lung Cancer Foundation. I met Matt a few months ago when I was tasked by my medical team to explore trials after scan results showed progression. Exploring trials felt similar to being placed in a foreign country where you don't speak the language and you're told to figure it out. I was overwhelmed, confused, and pretty scared. Thankfully, my surgeon referred me to GO2 and told me a little bit about their lung match program. And that's when everything seemed to shift. I felt like GO2 has become my Google Translate and my Google Maps in this foreign country called clinical trials. So today I am excited to talk with Matt about clinical trials, what they are, why they matter, especially for young people like myself, and how programs like Lung Match can empower people like me. I'm going to go ahead and briefly introduce Matt, and then I will let him introduce himself. So Matt is the manager of precision medicine and navigation at GO2 for lung cancer, where he oversees the Lung Match treatment and trial navigation program. Lung Match is a free service that connects individuals impacted by lung cancer with trained and compassionate navigators. The Lung Match team helps break down complex medical information, interpret biomarker test results, explore treatment options, and identify relevant clinical trials. This empowers individuals to make informed decisions about their care. Matt, I am so excited to have you on my podcast. Can you please introduce yourself and then we can dive in?
Yeah, happy to be here. So my name is Matt Rice. As you mentioned, I'm the manager of precision medicine for GO2. I've been at GO2 for lung cancer for about a year and a half at this point. I came out of my PhD where I studied genomic instability and cancer, and I really had a passion for trying to help people understand scientific concepts and also trying to take the scientific knowledge that I had, and I wanted to try to give it back to patients and try to help them understand their disease states and try to help where I could. So. I'm actually super excited about the role that I play because it allows me to talk to patients all the time and provide insights that I think that a lot of them find very valuable. So happy to be on this conversation with you. And clinical trials is a cornerstone of our program that I think there's a lot of misunderstanding around that. I think it's great to have a conversation and we can clarify some things.
And I'm just going to say you have this ability to break down such complex, like nuanced medical information into such an easy to digest way that makes it like very easy to understand for someone like myself that looking at medical information is pretty daunting and I don't understand a thing. So I really appreciate the fact that you're on this podcast and that you've helped me the last few months navigate this clinical trial process.
No, you've been doing great. I think a lot of people when they come to us, they say they don't feel like they know anything, but you and many people do demonstrate that they do have a pretty good understanding, but it's a large field. There's a lot of information and it's kind of hard to maybe parse out the most important pieces of information for yourself. And that's where we come into the role of we do this daily. So happy to do so. And it may come across that we know a lot because we do, but a lot of it comes from experience. So.
Yeah, well, I'm so excited. And we're going to dive into a little segment that I'm calling True or False Clinical Trials Edition. So we're going to put some common beliefs to the test and clear up some misconceptions along the way. So let's see what's fact and what is fiction. Are you ready?
Ready?
Okay. So true or false, some clinical trials are available as first line treatment options.
So that is true. There are many clinical trials that take place at different parts of people's disease states, where if there's someone who's more advanced, it often comes after having received multiple other treatments. But we do have clinical trials for people in first line treatment. First line being that's the first treatment that they receive. Often the studies that are in first line treatment, most of the time, those are not drugs that are brand new. They're usually drugs that have been tested and have been shown to be effective at later stages of disease, like maybe in second line or third line plus. And then they are reevaluating these drugs to be able to see if they are effective in first line therapy. And what they're really testing in that case is trying to see is this drug better than the current first line option?
I'm curious if you know how many people dive into clinical trials when they're first diagnosed, and does that tend to be people like earlier stage lung cancer or late stage lung cancer?
It's definitely fewer people that dive in earlier stage, and I think that that's more um, a product of just how we traditionally go about care. When you go into your initial diagnosis and you've been told you have, XYZ mutation, there's usually a standard of care option that the doctor is very familiar with, and then they're pretty much straightforward going to tell you, like, this is the option that we would treat with this. Patients who usually go into a first line clinical trial are either people who have kind of done the reading on their own ahead of time, that are aware of those trials and ask questions about, like, I potentially want to try this trial. Or occasionally there you will get a oncologist who's really plugged into the cutting edge of the field that may know that the drug that is in clinical trials may offer a better option compared to the current standard of care, and they may suggest it. But it's not super common for people to go through clinical trial and first line treatment. That's one of the things that we kind of are trying to change is just encourage people to, you don't need to take the first line clinical trial treatment, but we think that there's always a place for the conversation for clinical trials to be made anytime that you're going to have a treatment decision is just evaluate what your options are and kind of go from there. And then you asked a little bit about if it's more early stage versus late stage. I would say for first line treatments, a lot more of them are probably early stage lung cancer that you will see that in, but it's not impossible to find it in late stage.
Yeah, I don't think clinical trials have ever been brought up to me the past almost 3 years of this diagnosis until, I had progression recently, and I do have other options, but clinical trials seems to be for at this point the best option. And I've never thought about like maybe how people's perception may change if it's something at the very beginning of a diagnosis that is brought up with the patient provider interaction at the beginning of a diagnosis that may shift I don't know, like our thinking on clinical trials generally.
Yeah, I don't think that it's a disservice when doctors don't usually talk about clinical trials in the first line setting. I think it's just that for many people, we have a drug that we know exactly how well and how effective it should be, and usually that's why it's the standard of care.
Mhm.
Um, and often, if you have individuals that do want to explore first line clinical trials, it doesn't mean that the clinical trial is going to be their best option. It still might be the standard of care option.
Mhm.
It's just a matter of kind of shifting the conversation to be part of every step of the journey, as opposed to what I think traditionally what it is, which is exhausting all of your FDA approved options and then you go to clinical trials. That's what we really want to change because I think that there's a place for clinical trials a little bit earlier in the treatment journey.
Mhm. Especially when we aren't as like fatigued and exhausted and potentially weak from exhausting all of the other options to where we may be too weak to the point where we can't even join a trial.
Exactly. That's definitely a reality for some people that's important to consider.
Yeah. Okay, question number two. True or false? If you join a trial, you might get a placebo instead of the real treatment.
So I'm going to answer the word by word question you just said is technically true, but
Mhm.
I think that there's a misnomer in there that people tend to misunderstand just because of the way that we tend to talk about clinical trials. So in terms of when you get to a trial, could you receive a placebo? Placebo being no treatment at all. It is not impossible to receive no treatment at all in a cancer therapy trial, but it is exceedingly rare. In reality, what most people are going to get, if you're in a phase one or a phase two trial, which we'll talk a little bit more going forward, you're receiving the care that they're basically studying. No matter what, you will receive that therapy. It's really only in phase three that you kind of get the randomized version of like it's going to be this therapy that we're trying to learn more about versus some other option. Most of the time, that other option is the standard of care for that person at that point in their treatment journey, which for cancer patients is almost always something. It might be chemotherapy, it might be a different inhibitor that targets a specific mutation that you have. But often that standard of care is going to be the other option. And sometimes you'll hear people say that the placebo arm is something that you get assigned to, and you'll end up on basically what is the standard of care arm. So it's very, very, very rare that you would not receive any treatment at all. on the placebo arm unless the standard of care is no treatment. So often when you do see a placebo arm where someone receives no treatment, it's usually early stage lung cancer trials where we'll see this, where maybe they have their tumor resected, and then the standard of care is sometimes that you don't need to have any sort of follow-up treatment. In that case, the placebo arm would be no treatment. But if the standard of care is follow-up chemotherapy, again, some people may refer to it as a placebo, but the placebo in that case would be chemotherapy. So word for word, that statement could be a little misleading, but I think that my take-home point is always that for the average person, when you're on a trial that has two options, you are almost always guaranteed to receive some sort of therapy that is at least the standard of care. And it's only in very rare circumstances that you will receive no additional therapy, and it's only in those situations in which the standard of care is no therapy. That might have gotten a little confusing, so feel free to ask clarifying questions.
No, that does make sense. And I'm curious if this was different in the past. If at one point, because I'm wondering where this misconception started. Like at one point, did people actually receive placebos? Later stage trials also.
It probably was more common when we had fewer treatment options. For cancer specifically, I think like the first treatment option was really FDA approved was chemotherapy back in the 60s, early 60s. So I think basically ever since that first treatment option was approved, your standard of care is going to be some sort of chemotherapy option. Um, I think that the confusion primarily comes from the fact that placebo itself usually is referring to a sugar pill, is often the way most people tend to think of it. And I think that what we could do as researchers to kind of like clarify this a bit more is stop using the word placebo unless they actually mean placebo and start using the term standard of care, which you do see a little bit for some of these clinical trials when you see the design of the trial nowadays, they will say you'll be either in the experimental arm or the standard of care arm. And we're starting to shift away from that language to try to clarify some of those points.
As I've been speaking with different hospitals, everyone uses standard of care. I don't think one person has used the word placebo, but prior to this experience, I thought that people were offered placebos with like in double blind studies. I thought placebos.
It's mostly in online communities that you'll see that word a lot more now. I think that a lot of healthcare professionals have started to make a cognizant effort of trying not to use that word as much as possible, but it still makes its way into the zeitgeist a little bit.
It does, yeah. Okay, question number three. True or false? You can leave a clinical trial at any time.
That one is absolutely true. You can leave a clinical trial for any reason at any time. You do not need to provide an explanation for why you want to leave a trial, although they will likely just ask for their own records. But you should be able to leave at any point of care, and it will not impact your access to healthcare down the line in any way, shape, or form. Participating in a clinical trial is entirely voluntary.
Are there any costs to leaving a clinical trial?
No, not generally. There might be a cost associated with traveling to the clinical trial may have incurred some cost to you for, potentially a flight or a bus or something like that. But nope, there shouldn't be any sort of expense to you for having to leave. The only thing I could think of potentially might be is if you were on a clinical trial where they provide some sort of equipment to you. Most of the time, I'm assuming they're going to ask for that equipment back. If you didn't, I'm sure there would be a cost associated with that, but that would be an extremely rare circumstance.
If you're on a double blind, in a double blind trial, and you decide to leave the trial halfway through, you're told which arm that you were randomized into, right? So you'll know what treatment you had been receiving.
It depends on the trial. Sometimes they kind of hold that information until the trial has concluded. Sometimes they will let you know once you have left the trial.
Okay. Next question, true or false? You can only join one clinical trial in your lifetime.
That's a great question. It is not true. That is a false statement. You can join as many clinical trials in your lifetime as you would like. Sometimes it gets a little more difficult to join a clinical trial if you have been on a previous clinical trial, just because sometimes with the way these trials are designed, they want to avoid patients that may have received other experimental medications. That is very case by case. But you can join as many clinical trials as you are eligible for in your lifetime. There is no limit.
Next question, true or false? Not all lung cancer treatments were once in a clinical trial. Tagrisso is one example.
So it's a great question. It is a false statement as well. All FDA approved therapies have gone through clinical trials before they are given to patients on a wide scale. And in fact, they go through actually multiple clinical trials depending on what their different indications are or what they're being given for. So Tagrisso is actually a great example of this because when it was first approved, Tagrisso was only given to people with stage 4 non-small cell lung cancer that had a very specific mutation called EGFR T790M, which is a very specific mutation that's found in only a small percentage of individuals with EGFR. Since then, it has also expanded, and now you have a lot of people receive Tagrisso in the first line setting, whether or not they have that T790M mutation. However, that updated approval comes from clinical data that may be partially reliant on some of the trial data they had already performed, but a lot of it ends up being new data that they gain from other clinical trials. So you can even now at earlier stages, like stage 2 and stage 3, receive Tagrisso, and that comes from different studies where they showed that using that same drug in a different population of patients is still effective and safe before they were able to give it an approval. And all FDA approved drugs have received some sort of clinical trial prior to going to market. It's something we've done traditionally ever since the first chemotherapy drug was approved back in the early 60s.
So if I'm understanding, the same drug may go through trials multiple different times throughout its lifetime.
Yes, sometimes they can, from the same study, pull different information out of it and apply different approvals or different indications from the same data set. But often, if they're going to try to take that drug and apply it to a new population of patients, so again, say stage 4 is what it was originally approved for, and now they want to look at stage 2 and 3 patients, they're going to have to do a separate study that shows that is still effective for those patients because what happens in those early stage patients may not be a perfect translation of what happens in stage 4. So they have to do a separate clinical trial to study it.
So if a drug is approved and it goes back to trials, does it start out at phase 1 or does it go to a different phasing?
So I think it really depends case by case. I think it's really common that if the drug has already received FDA approval, that they don't need to necessarily start at phase 1 because at that point they've pretty much shown that it is safe to give to people. They may potentially ask them to start at phase 2, or sometimes they allow them to restart at phase 1 but combine it with phase 2, which is known as a phase 1/2 study. Um, and that might be in situations where maybe they've gone from lung cancer to now they're looking at breast cancer. So again, a different patient population, so they'll want them to do their due diligence to make sure it's safe in that population. But if it's the same patient population in general, maybe just an earlier stage, it really comes down to what the FDA, they basically ask the FDA what they're allowed to do. And if they can, they will often kind of try to skip that first initial step of dose escalation because it's kind of basically been identified at that point.
Is a drug considered safer if it's approved for different stages of lung cancer or multiple types of cancer?
I don't know if we can really say that it makes it safer per se. The reason that we test it at different stages in different trials is just because the disease state of what you're kind of dealing with is very different once you have reached stage 4 compared to some of the earlier stages. The cells tend to be more mesenchymal, meaning that they tend to be more motile. They move around a lot more, which is why you have metastases. And then different diseases, like we can kind of like when we look and see that a drug works really well in breast cancer, we can hope that it will work really well in lung cancer, but it's never going to be a perfect one-to-one comparison. So that's why they have to do a different trial for it. Sometimes you'll see for early drugs, when it's like first in human studies, you'll have a phase 1 trial where they're not looking at just lung. They'll look at basically like all solid tumors is something that they might say. And they'll be looking at 5 or 6 different types of solid tumors all in phase 1. And based off of those results is where they'll decide, okay, it doesn't really work in colon cancer. It does work in lung cancer. Let's go into phase 2 for lung specifically, and let's not go into phase 2. So it's a process, and every drug has its own story a little bit.
Okay, last question, true or false? GO2 for lung cancer only offers one-on-one support on screening and treatment options.
So that is also false. GO2 for lung cancer does a lot more than just those two things. So yes, we do guidance on screening and treatment, but we also do clinical trial matching through Lung Match. We have ability to talk to you guys about biomarker testing, where to get it. Also, once you have received the results, how to understand them and how it may impact your treatments themselves. We have free educational resources for anyone who's looking to try to find more information they can understand from home, whether that be for doctors they want to use it within their own clinic or for patients who are doing their own research. We have opportunities for people to do research collaborations. If you're a researcher that you want to kind of potentially look within the lung cancer population at a specific type of study, we do some collaborative efforts around that. We have an advocacy arm that works on the Hill to try to advocate for people to have better health care and better access to health care across the country. And there's a lot more that we do as an organization. So, in general, if there's anyone who's interested in learning a little bit more about GO2, I encourage you to go to our website, which is go2, the number two, at .org. And there's a wonderful helpline number listed right at the top left that if you have any questions, you can reach out.
You. So now that we've set the stage, let's talk a little more about clinical trials, what they actually are, how they work, and why they are such a critical part in lung cancer care. Clinical trials, like you said, often can feel intimidating or like a last resort. So can you please start by explaining what exactly is a clinical trial?
Yeah. So a clinical trial, in general, is basically a research study where they are taking some drug or treatment or approach to treatment, and they are evaluating it in humans to be able to see if it is safe and if it is effective. Now, generally speaking, they'll do that in different phases to try to step through that process in a way that ensures that people are receiving the treatment safely. But ultimately, what they're trying to do is evaluate if this new technology or approach is going to be helpful to people. And then they end up ultimately trying to compare that new technology or treatment against the existing technology or treatment. Because a lot of what they do nowadays for clinical trials is they don't want to just create another new drug that you can use in the first line. They really want to be able to find what's the best drug to give to you. So most of the time nowadays, you actually have to show not only that you're as good as the current standard of care, but you actually need to be better than the standard of care most of the time.
And how would they prove that they're better than the standard of care?
So when you are creating a clinical trial, you often have to, before you start, define what you are looking for and how much of an improvement you are trying to find within patients. So often for cancer treatments, what that means is increasing either the person's overall survival, the amount of time that they live after receiving the treatment, or increasing potentially the progression-free survival, the amount of time that person can be on treatment before they have a recurrence of disease. Or sometimes they also will be looking to see that you can improve upon side effects. There are some really effective therapies that we have for lung cancer that do have some serious side effects. That if you can also find a drug that potentially performs about as well in terms of overall survival, but has substantially improved safety, that is also an avenue in which you can kind of explore trying to get an FDA approved therapy.
How do I ask this? So you mentioned overall survival being a measurement of gauging if a trial is successful or not. That could mean years and years and years, right, before FDA approval, if they're waiting for people to essentially pass to see, if it's longer or shorter duration. So how long do some trials go before they're possibly FDA approved?
So there are many studies that will actually look at survival going out as far as about 5 years. That's more or less the standard in terms of survival data for most studies. But there are also opportunities that the FDA kind of recognize that there are some therapies that have really promising results for people, and they don't want to wait that long to get a potentially life-saving treatment to patients as soon as possible. So you actually will sometimes also see what we call an accelerated FDA approval where they allow the therapy to use surrogate endpoints or some other endpoint to show that it is really effective in the treatment that they're trying to use it for. And what they will do is they sometimes will allow the FDA accelerated approval to get the drug to market sooner. but it's not a free pass. When you receive an accelerated approval, it means that you are then under increased scrutiny from the FDA to report out the remaining findings for your overall survival at that 5 year time point, as well as to show that these patients are still continuing to respond well and have safe outcomes from receiving the drug. And if somewhere down the line the data doesn't end up living up to that standard, the FDA can then withdraw the FDA approval that was accelerated. Other times, and more often, if it was promising originally, it will tend to be promising in 5 years from now, and you end up getting a traditional full FDA approval.
Who is able to participate in a trial?
Anyone can participate in a clinical trial. For United States, pretty much anyone over the age of 18 can participate in a clinical trial. There will be certain trials that will look only specifically for women. There will be certain trials that look only specifically for men. That depends really on what that trial is being designed to look at. Um, and there are also trials for individuals who are under the age of 18. That is an entirely different world of clinical trials that I don't really touch on personally, but they do exist as options. But in terms of like for each individual trial, can anyone get onto it? The answer is going to be no. So every trial is going to have a very detailed list of what they call inclusion and exclusion criteria that is going to detail basically what's the patient they're looking for and what sorts of health factors or treatment history or maybe their biomarkers in non-small cell lung cancer, it's really common to see the biomarker be a inclusion criteria to determine which type of patient should be on this trial. So for example, if you have a trial that is looking at a targeted therapy that is for EGFR positive non-small cell lung cancer, that is being used for people after they have progressed on first line treatment, then you're excluding anyone who does not have an EGFR mutation. You're excluding people who have not received treatment yet because they haven't had a first line therapy. Sometimes that first line therapy, it will be very detailed. They want to know that you've been on a specific type of first line therapy as opposed to one of the two, three options. Also, often with these clinical trials, they will want the patient to be a relative degree of healthy. So people who are not potentially able to take care of themselves if the drug itself is predicted to have maybe side effects that may impact quality of life. They want to be responsible and not have you take the drug if you would not be able to continue caring for yourself effectively. So understanding each individual trial and if it's right for you as a patient is a process that takes a little bit of practice and reading through the lines and understanding when they write something exactly what does it mean. But that's where a service like Lung Match comes in that we can kind of help you navigate that process.
Yes, 100%, because it's very confusing to sort through all of the eligibility criterias and
Some of them are very short. Like there are a few I've been on the page for that have maybe 4 or 5 inclusion or
Mm.
4 or 5 exclusion criteria. And maybe I didn't qualify what those are. Inclusion criteria means you must have these things. Exclusion criteria means if you have these things, you cannot be on the trial. Um, and some of them are very short. They may only have a couple each of those. And I've also had ones where it appears to be basically a book, and there's about 30 things that you have to make sure that you meet. And it really comes down to the trial itself.
So a question that comes up often is what are the different phases of a trial and what exactly does that mean?
That's a great question. So, clinical trials, rather than just being one giant study that takes place when we have a new drug and we give it to a bunch of people and then we determine if it works and if it's safe or not, is actually done in a very strictly regulated way that we call phases. So, in reality, there's 4 phases, but most of the time you hear people talk about 3 phases. Phase 1 studies are going to be for a drug that after it's shown some sort of preclinical promise, meaning that it's been studied in a laboratory, it seems to work for a specific type of cancer cells. And from the laboratory data that we can create in animal models, it seems like it will be safe and effective. We'll go into phase 1 studies, which usually last about 2 years or so and maybe include somewhere between 10 and 100 people, depending on the trial. Phase 1 studies, what they're really looking to do is determine ultimately like what is the best dose to be giving to these people for this drug so that we see some sort of effect. And also, is it safe? If there is any sort of sign that the drug is not going to be effective in humans, because it's not always a perfect one-to-one, something that works really well in mice, for example, may not work in humans at all. Um, Pharmaceutical companies want to know really early whether or not it's not going to be effective or if it's not going to be safe for people. And if that's the case, then it will never go past phase one, or sometimes phase one will even end early if there's a reason to say that it's not worth going on farther. So phase one studies tend to take about a year or two. And I think about 70% of drugs that enter phase one end up going on to phase two. So we're already losing a chunk of people right there. Phase two trials also take about a year or two. And this is where they are really going to kind of like involve a larger group of individuals. So most of the time, phase two trials are somewhere between 100 and 300 participants, usually on the lower end of that. And this is really where they're starting to drill down into the effectiveness a little bit more. They want to start looking a little bit more at for specific treating populations, for like lung cancer, for example. When we've been giving people this drug, do they seem to be deriving some sort of benefit from taking it? And they'll collect some data along those lines. And they will also continue to collect more safety data because they've been giving it to more patients. And again, pharmaceutical company is looking for a reason to say, yes, this looks promising, let's keep going, or no, this does not look like it's going to be promising enough, or it's unsafe, we need to stop at this point. So about 33% of the drugs that enter in phase two will go on to phase three. So we're already losing another huge chunk of drugs there, which is starting now you're starting to see a little bit like why we lose so many drugs in clinical trial space. Phase three is really like where the big study takes place that a lot of people think of when they think of clinical trials. So phase three are usually the trials that are going to be set for someone between 300 to 3,000 people. There's some very, very large clinical trials for phase three sometimes. And what they're really looking to do is now we have been able to show that we think it is effective and we think that it is safe. Now we're going to give it to a bunch of people and compare it to the current standard of care to show that it is, again, for most trials nowadays, not only equal to the current standard of care, but in fact, it's better than the standard of care. Because what all these companies are trying to do ultimately is find the next drug that can be the first line treatment, or if they're looking for a specific treatment that's meant to be as a follow-up to another treatment, maybe they're trying to go for a second line treatment. But they want to be able to generate enough data to show that their treatment is the best choice for an individual at a given stage of disease. Phase three trials take a lot longer. Usually, I've seen them done in as little as 2 years, but that's quite rare. Most of the time, they tend to take somewhere between 3 to 5, sometimes longer, years. And only about 25% of drugs that enter that state will end up going all the way through the trial and end up ultimately then applying for an FDA approval, either as a new drug or sometimes they will kind of amend what their current indications are. And that is the general process for most drugs to get to market. There is a stage four, or a phase four rather, for clinical trials. And that's just for all drugs, basically, that once it's approved, they don't just basically get a free check to just be in the market and not be regulated. Phase four trials are basically ongoing research done by the FDA to ensure that people who are receiving the drug are still receiving it safely and that it's still showing a good effect. And most of the time, they can update the warnings for that drug if there's a reason to think that it has a new side effect that they didn't see before, or if there's any reason that they ever wanted to pull it from market, that's where that comes from. Ultimately, what phase four trials are really doing is just making sure that in a real world population that the drug is still working the way that it looked like in the trial. And the reason they do that is because clinical trials are very, very tightly controlled in a very specific subset of people. And sometimes when you get into a real world population, things get a little bit more wishy-washy, and they want to just make sure that people are still receiving drugs that are safe and effective.
So I'm hearing phase one is measuring dose and safety. Please interrupt me if I'm wrong. Phase two is measuring effectiveness and ongoing safety. Phase three is measuring, is it better than the standard of care?
That's the basic way of summing it up. Yep. And then phase one and phase two, generally, you don't have another treatment that you're comparing it to. You might be comparing different combinations of treatment. Like maybe you're doing drug X with drug Y, or you're testing drug X alone and drug Y alone. But you don't usually compare it against the standard of care till phase three. But yeah, generally speaking, that is the correct process.
Can one assume that if someone has the option of joining a phase one or a phase 2 or 3, that a phase 2 or 3 is a better option than a phase 1, or are there any benefits to moving forward with a phase 1 trial?
So I think it really depends on the patient themselves. I think that sometimes phase one trials can kind of have like a bad rap of people thinking that we just have never tried the drug in humans before, and that's not always true. Sometimes phase one trials could be a drug that is FDA approved in a different cancer that we know what the side effect is going to be, but we just haven't tried it in humans for lung cancer, for example, yet. And then sometimes being in phase one is just obviously the first time that it's being used in humans, but it might be a really promising drug. So a really hot topic area right now, for example, were antibody drug conjugates, for example, which is taking kind of like the targeting aspect of targeted therapies and the systemic effect of chemotherapy and putting them into one compound. Those all had a start in phase one, but ADCs are really common nowadays to be people like doing lots and lots of studies with them. So if you wanted to be on the cutting edge of receiving one of those, at some point it was in phase one. So sometimes people choose phase one studies because they know they're going to receive the treatment. And some of these treatments are really promising and people want to have access to them a little bit earlier.
You often hear people say clinical trial participants are basically guinea pigs. Would you say that there's any truth to this?
I can understand why it's a question and why it's a fear for many people. I completely empathize with that fear. But generally speaking, it's not true. No one is going to be truly a guinea pig. I think that the fear comes that they're going to be given a compound or treatment that no one has ever received before, and they don't know if it's going to be safe or not. Nothing is going to reach a clinical trial at all, even phase one, prior to having received preclinical um, data that is supporting that it's effective and safe. So preclinical data usually will start in a petri dish where they're taking cancer cells that are often taken from humans that have these specific mutations that the drug is meant to treat, and they're comparing them against the treatment to make sure that the treatment is killing those cancer cells. And once we have really good evidence that the treatment is effective in a dish, they will bring it up to an animal and then try to make sure that we can understand that, again, still it is effective in an animal, a higher level species. And that it is being safely given to these animals. Because when you give it to an animal model, you can actually see do they have some of these side effects that we might expect to have in humans. And then only once that body of evidence is supporting that that drug in preclinical data is safe and effective, then we try giving it to humans. But even in that human setting and early phase stuff, it's being done very, very carefully. We don't give it to a lot of people at first. We make sure that you are very closely watched in clinical trials. I actually think that people who are on clinical trials tend to have slightly better care just because they see their doctor more often. You receive more tests, you receive more blood work. And they're really trying to make sure that they understand that you are benefiting from the drug and that anything that you are experiencing after having been given the drug, whether it is related to the drug or not, they document it so that they can understand if the drug might be playing a role in it. So I understand the fear of like being a guinea pig potentially, but I do think that clinical trials are very safe and well designed to make sure that you are getting something that we believe is going to work well for you and that is safe for you to be taking.
So it sounds like even though some people move forward first in human phase 1 trials, that researchers are doing everything they can to ensure patient safety when someone enters the trial.
Absolutely. And it's not just the researchers who are always trying to do that themselves. You have to keep in mind many of these researchers are your oncologists. They have an interest in making sure that you are taken care of. But they also have very tight regulation from the FDA. They have to be reporting all these different outcomes to the FDA. So the FDA is aware of these things happening as well. So there's a lot of oversight through the clinical trial process. You pretty much can't even have a runny nose without it being at least documented somewhere.
Another question that comes to mind for me is trials historically haven't included all populations, women, young people, people of color. So I'm wondering if that's shifting, if researchers are mindful of this and if it, impacts, these populations today.
No, definitely. Yeah, historically, a lot of clinical trials have not been very representative of, let's say, the world population for which lung cancer affects. Obviously, lung cancer doesn't really see borders or race or gender. So there's been a big push with a lot of companies nowadays, as well as from organizations like us, that they need to try to create more inclusive and representative clinical trial populations. And what they're trying to do to address these things now is one, trying to do more outreach specifically within communities that are a little bit more poorly represented in clinical trials. African Americans, for example, tend to be more hesitant to participate in a clinical trial, which I think is an obvious reason when you look at the history of how medicine, specifically in the United States, has treated some African Americans. However, I think that again, when we've been designing these trials nowadays, they're very carefully designed. So it's a matter of trying to make sure that we're reaching these individuals in a respectful manner through individuals that they trust to be able to talk about what these options are and why it could potentially be an option for them. I think it's important to make sure that they don't feel that they are being pushed into a clinical trial, but that they are just being made aware of it. But also, historically, a lot of clinical trials have been done primarily at really large medical institutions, which, generally speaking, tend to draw on very specific populations of individuals. Most of these large medical institutions, for example, live or exist in metropolitan cities. So you tend to get people who live closer to cities are more likely to exist in clinical trials than individuals who live in more rural areas. What they're trying to do nowadays, and what we always are advocating for them to do with these new clinical trials, is try to open them up to more community-based health systems that maybe see different populations of patients than they are traditionally enrolling on clinical trials. And I think that we have seen an improvement in the last couple of years of more people and more diverse backgrounds being able to participate in clinical trials. And I think it will continue to get better as we go forward. And it's really important we do that because there's also data that shows that, how one set of individuals respond to a certain therapy may not be exactly how people in a different set of individuals respond to that therapy. So it's really important to be able to not only include them in the trial, but understand how individuals that have one background respond differently to a treatment compared to people who have a different background.
Matt, I just want to say thank you for all of your thoughtful answers and your time on today's episode. That is it for today of our first episode of the One Lung Lounge. And again, thank you, Dr. Matt Rice and GO2 for joining me. We've covered a lot, but we are not done yet. Be sure to tune in for part two, where Matt and I will dive deeper into GO2's lung match program as well as listener questions. Again, Matt, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.